Hello and welcome to Right Medicine. I'm your host, Alex Howson, and I'm here today with Mark Riotto, founder and president of the Research Post. And we're going to be talking about changes in medical publications and the world of disseminating clinical data. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me on board. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good to see you. And I know that you had a session on CME Palooza in the fall. How did that go?
Yeah, that was great fun. The CME area is doing a lot more in terms of how to communicate, advancing digital formats, and certainly using the technology available to achieve their medical education objectives. So it's an area that I've been following more closely as I've been working on the Research Post.
So tell listeners, first of all, who you are and what you do.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So I'm the president and the founder of the Research Post, which is a peer-reviewed publishing channel, open access, built on a visual presentation format. I worked in medical publications for the pharmaceutical industry for 25 years, either at large or mid-sized companies, and some agency work in there as well. And after a long time of working on this, I was just trying to find a different approach to medical publications that we could talk about in a little bit more detail. And before that, I had some experience in healthcare publishing and healthcare journalism back from first jobs after college.
So you've been in the publications world for quite a time. So what kind of prompted you to start thinking about medical publishing in a different way and to really zero in on visual presentation?
Yeah, it's something that I was struggling with for a while with the projects that I was working on in the pharmaceutical industry. They took a long time to get published, kind of par for the course, and they were expensive. From that environment, working with a pharmaceutical industry sponsoring publications that can be very expensive to deliver that project and take a lot of time. And it's not just the cost resources involved, but just the effort, the teams that are involved, the review process. It's a very big process. And at the end of the day, I was just looking at the projects I'm working on taking too long and costing too much. And regardless of what business activity you're delivering, whether you're manufacturing something or delivering some kind of service, if it costs too much and takes too long, that's bad business. So I was looking for a way to improve on those pain points. And what hit me shortly after doing it is it's not just the time and the cost that's involved, but ultimately it's the patient information and how fast we can get information to patients. So by setting up the Research Post, what I'm trying to accomplish is publish information in a visual presentation format, which is where data starts after a clinical trial is completed. Someone has a slide deck, and this is speaking mostly from the pharmaceutical industry and where I've spent most of my career. Someone has a slide deck and they're sharing that internally or limited external stakeholders. And that is what people know and they talk about, and that's what's used from an educational perspective as well. And then I was, in my role, was going into putting that into a format of long text, thousands and thousands of words that took months and months to deliver. And at the end of the day, I couldn't be sure how much readership that was getting, right? How many of the projects I was working on were getting a deep, full read from that. And you probably know from your experience too, people have their selection strategies on what they have time to read. There's an information overload, so we can't read everything. And then even if they do opt to dive into an article, it's usually some kind of skimming strategy that they might have, how to get the most bang for it, and they'll dive into and read a few full manuscripts. For the most part, their readers are limited in how much time they have to digest all the information that's out there. So I'm trying to put it into a format that we can use, publish it sooner, because you can cut back on some of that development time, and then really put it into a format that people can use. We're used to reading everything on our phones. We read it on our phone, we're digital, we're mobile, and you can share it with your friends and your colleagues and just scroll through some images and get to that. So I'm trying to put it into a visual format as opposed to that long text format for certain types of data.
So let's talk a little bit about data and formats. I definitely want to get into the question about process, but what kind of data do you see as appropriate for a visual presentation, and how are you formatting that presentation?
Yeah, so I think that every kind of study output is appropriate for data visualization. Like I said before, that kind of is where it starts from a discussion point. Let's take a look at the data, and that's not taking a look at a long study report or a manuscript. It's normally looking at the visual presentation of the data. From the research post perspective, the type of format that we're accepting right now are slide presentations formatted as PDF for obvious reasons. So someone can take your slide deck and edit it and use it in some other format. But it would be to take a look at what kind of data works for this format at this stage of it, as basically a startup and a new form of peer-reviewed publication. Is where it fits is that secondary analysis of a study where the manuscript and the primary methodology and primary results are already published, peer-reviewed, published in the manuscript, but there may be more data coming out of that study, or there could be pooled analysis across the program. Some of the other types of data that where it might look to be an option would be pooled analysis, secondary analysis, real-world evidence studies, some of these registry studies that go on for a long time, and they have multiple manuscripts over the course of a study. Health economics data, because sometimes you just need to get something published. And I would encourage people to think about what their Congress presentations look like, and where you get a few minutes to present at a Congress. You have 7 or 8 minutes, if that. And that might include 2 minutes for Q&A, where you might have room for 7 or 8 slides. And I would say, take a look, and you might be able to add 5 or 6 slides, get up into the 14, 15, 16 slide decks, tell a deeper story, actually, and get that submitted to the research post, and we'll get it peer reviewed similar to what a medical journal would do, and then come back to you with feedback and have some back and forth within the peer review process to get that published. And again, it's in a format that people can then use, right?
And what's your
format, visual?
Yeah.
The platform can handle other formats of submissions beyond just slides as PDFs, but right now we have that functionality turned off just to build that base of information in a comfort zone with slide decks, which people are very comfortable dealing with.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned that you're faster than the kind of conventional publication process. What's your sort of turnaround time?
The few publications that we've had submitted so far for peer review, we've been able to get them peer reviewed in less than 2 weeks.
Wow. That's really impressive.
And other certain journals can do that as well.
So,
we're not the only one that can move that quickly. But I do think as a rule with peer review, and I think it is a challenge, and not every peer review that I've worked on has been easy either. But I think as a rule with the research post, because I'm going to be sending someone maybe 15 or so slides to peer review as opposed to a 40 or 50 page manuscript, that can cut down on the burden of peer review. It's a shift in the format that we'll have to navigate as well, because peer reviewers are used to seeing full-length manuscripts, and we're going to give them something a little bit different to take a look at. Now, it might be that we have to request a statistical analysis plan or a protocol summary to support the peer review, so you can kind of look under the hood and make sure that the slides that you're publishing are justified and match what you set out to do in a fuller methodology. But for the most part, we think that we wouldn't publish those, but that would just be for the peer review process to make sure that we can provide a quality peer review. Peer review is not perfect. There's many stories about the limitations of peer review, but it remains the gold standard, and we recognize that and want to do as quality of peer review as the next guy.
And I appreciate that you brought up that issue of what peer reviewers are seeing in the process, and maybe we'll dig into peer review a little bit in a few moments. And also that you talked about the kinds of data that are appropriate for the research post, because I was going to ask about context. When you've got a slide deck, you lose so much context, and that's the value of manuscripts and written documents, is it provides that kind of wraparound and that framework for thinking about and sorting through the data. So it makes sense that you would be focusing on particular kinds of data and where that data is in the data production process.
And I think it's where it's within, where it falls within the scientific or medical communication strategy as well. Or is it a follow-up study to address a specific scientific question or market need, if it's a payer discussion question? And I think that's what helps drive the decision for whether the research post is appropriate or not. And what I would say is if there's a sponsor or research and they have a new mechanism of action for a new cancer drug that is truly groundbreaking and it should go to one of the leading journals in the world, by all means go there. The research post is probably not there yet. Would I love to get that kind of data? Absolutely. But I recognize where we fit in the process right now. But I think that some of that secondary analysis that comes out of it or other exploratory work that might come out of that research stream would be appropriate for the research post. And you can get it out at the same time as, or shortly after a primary manuscript or key secondary manuscript might publish. Because when I put my publication lead hat on, and if you're looking at a study or a series of studies and you have multiple manuscripts that would come out of it, you publish the first one. And the best data I found is that takes a median time of 15 months. You get published in one of the leading journals, so that means half take longer. I think that study showed that the average data age for publishing in the leading medical journals, as we know that short list, is the data might be 3 years old by the time it's published. And that has an impact on patient care as well. But from a communication strategy perspective, when you have your primary manuscript, usually you don't start the second one till you get peer review comments on the first one, and then that one could take 15 months or longer. And if there's a third one, well, that one could publish 3 or whatever years after the first one get published. And the way information moves so quickly today, that could negatively impact patient care if there's something important in there. And that was something that hit me quickly after starting the research post, as I was trying to address the pain points I saw in my role in the pharmaceutical industry around time and cost. But really, it's the impact on patients from there with delay in communicating information. And if the goal should be to get information to clinicians as quickly as possible to ideally help a patient's quality of life or maybe even survival, that's something that I think we should all be striving for. And the traditional way that, as I saw it, wasn't always addressing that need to get information to patients as quickly as possible.
And what's your process then for turning the visual data, the clinical data that you receive in a slide deck or some other kind of visual format, and turning that into something that is accessible, digestible, shareable across different and devices and so on?
Yeah, so with the visual format, I think that is something that most people can understand. Through the slide deck, and you would have your setup similar to a Congress presentation where you're presenting the problem, the objective of the study, a summary of the methodology, and then your key results in slide format, ideally in visual, or a couple tables and bullet points from there. But the process to accelerate this would be to take those slides, and someone might have a slide deck 24 or 48 hours after someone completes a study, there's a slide deck. And I would say, give me your 15 best slides and we'll get them peer reviewed and published. So once we go back through the peer review process, and we'll make sure to address that the author has a copyright statement on it in terms of how they want to own that. We are open access. We're trying to give authors and study sponsors greater ownership over their data so that they can then use it as they see fit to communicate it afterwards without having to request permission from us. We want the authors and the sponsors to maintain their copyrights with the thinking that they've spent a lot of money, millions or maybe tens of millions or more on a study, that they should own those data and then be able to use them for other purposes and other communications as they see fit.
And you've talked about the peer review process, or you've touched on that a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about how you're managing the peer review process?
Yeah, so we have a team of editorial advisors. We have 10 editorial advisors on board and a couple patient communication advisors. We're looking to add more of those as well. Based on the nature of the format, is we're trying to be a format that's accessible to everyone. So when we get a submission that would be appropriate for a patient education or patient communication, to run it by our patient communication advisors and say, hey, does this format work? Will a typical educated patient understand the presentation of the data in this format? And their patients are being asked to get more involved in their healthcare decisions.
For
but
sure.
The information that we're asking them to use, or that they're being asked to use to make that informed decision, are largely inaccessible to them, either because it's in a journal that they don't have access to because they don't subscribe to, or there's a paywall behind it, or it's written in a long text format that they may or likely may not understand, right? And despite all the pushes around health literacy and plain language summaries, I think there's still some barriers to getting information out there for patients and other healthcare providers as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about plain language summaries, because it seems to me that this is a perfect vehicle for generating those kinds of summaries for patients. Is that something that you're planning or a space, a role for?
We have not gotten any yet. With the software format as it's structured, there's certainly an opportunity to do a plain language summary, either as a separate submission, and you could make it visual, similar to what we want our regular submissions to be in, or our original submissions. So you could do a plain language summary with a figure and then some text to describe it and make it manageable for that audiences. Or you could do it as like a blog post as well, right? So there's a blog function within the software as well. Once you sign up and become a member and you get your profile, and you have to be a member to submit something. We would encourage all authors to become members, but at least one author has to be a member to submit something to get into our review process. But the plain language summary is something that we're certainly advocating for, and think that we can be a good platform for that. It's certainly something that has gotten great attention within the medical publications area on how to do them. Some companies do them as a rule every time out. Others do not. Not every journal accepts them. So,
yeah, I'm seeing that some companies would do that as a point of fact. And I think it's mandated in Europe, isn't it?
Yes.
To have plain language summaries of trial results and so on. I wanted to ask.
I need a cough.
Yeah, sure.
Excuse me. Yeah. All right.
Take a sip.
I'm glad
as well,
you can
actually. Yeah, me too. What was I going to ask there? I lost my train of thought. I do want to talk about copyright.
Yeah, we were talking about plain language summaries in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you do see a few more plain language summaries in the US as a matter of course, and they seem to be I think they're mandated in Europe, aren't they?
I believe so. Yeah, and it seems that there's other transparency initiatives that are taking place as well, but across the world. Europe has Plan S. Here in the U.S., we recently saw the Nelson memo come out a few months ago saying that all government-funded research, not just medical research, should be published in an open access format, and that takes place at the end of 2025. So this is coming in terms of open access and other transparency initiatives to make sure that research is accessible to all. Going back to what we were talking about before, is if just because a manuscript is open access, would that mean that it's then accessible to a lay audience or to a patient or to a caregiver to understand if it's in a traditional format with long text behind it? I'm thinking that's something that we're trying to address with the research post, to put something into a visual format, and that might be more understandable despite the other initiatives around transparency and open access. the long text format may or may not be how people want to receive information this day and age.
No, for sure. And do you see potential connection between what you're doing and what continuing medical education is doing? I'll rephrase that actually. Do you see a role for collaboration with CME organizations to use what you're doing, since you've already got that material in a very kind of accessible visual format, as a supplement or as a foundation for education activities that are being, designed and delivered?
Ideally, from a business model perspective, we would like to get into that kind of presentation format where you could do educational programs through the research post format as we expand and grow our business and stuff. But from a med ed perspective, in terms of doing research, sure, I would love for post that we publish to be cited in ongoing events, and to facilitate that, we are approved for a digital object identifier for referencing, because it would be very hard to find someone's, say, online or Facebook post from last August, but with the DOI for referencing, you can just click on that reference and it does take you back, and we'll link you right back to the reference. So that's an important part of what making this work, right? Without the ability to have a DOI for published research posts, this would not work. But I think the collaboration with CME is an opportunity not just to have the research that we publish get cited in ongoing med ed programs, but also to take a look at whether the research post would be an appropriate venue to publish some of the needs assessments or outcomes analysis that come out of a med ed program, and say, here was the baseline learning. And it ran a program, and then here at the end, and we tested again, we saw improvement in these parameters, and then maybe still this unmet need remains as something to address, because there's a lot of that research going on that may or may not get published otherwise, but it informs disease awareness or physician understanding of concepts within the area. And I think especially as we look at an area where, for example, oncology research is growing every day. Gene therapies and cell therapies are advancing the science on a daily, weekly basis. Great breakthroughs across the way. So how do we measure what people know, and what do they know through medical education? And then how do you communicate that kind of information back to say, yeah, here's an area we still need to work on.
I love that idea. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
We'll just go back to my original point. We can do it as a manuscript, but that could take 15 months. So we think that this is well suited to try and communicate that a little bit sooner, get that information out faster.
I think it's really interesting to think about what you're doing as a kind of repository for needs assessments and outcomes reports and that kind of thing, because the CME field's been talking about having that kind of repository for years and years, and it is very time consuming to get that kind of information out into the public domain via manuscripts, and so many just don't get published at all or even get into the review process. But there is still that kind of proprietary legacy, particularly attached to needs assessments. It'd be hard to get access to companies' needs assessments. So I'm liking that idea of opening up transparency for those kinds of vehicles as well. You touched on copyright a couple of times. What are the copyright implications for your authors?
Like I said before, we want the authors and the sponsors to own their data. We want to give them control over their data and how they communicate it. And I look back at my time in the pharmaceutical industry is just because and the publications team would work with the authors, and just because they got published in a high impact factor journal, so to speak, it doesn't mean that the rest of the company then stops doing what they do from a communication perspective, from a scientific exchange perspective, or medical science liaisons and MedInfo, standard response letters, and all the communication activities of a pharmaceutical company as a sponsor. And that's where I have most of my career, so that's what I think of a lot. So all of that happens regardless of whether you publish the data, regardless of where you publish the data. And I'm just of the mindset that if the data has more value once it's published, and then the rest of those educational activities can happen either through scientific exchange or commercial communication if it meets those regulatory requirements for commercial communication. And if you can start those discussions 6, 9, or 12 months earlier, I see more value in that as opposed to just, hey, we published in this journal, which has a reputation for being great. And that's what we're trying to address with the copyright that we're offering. It is to make sure that the authors are providing a copyright statement. We're not copyright lawyers, but we tell them, hey, you should include something. Here are some options that you might want to consider, and then let them make the decision. But make sure that they're putting copyright on it, that they can use it even for a commercial perspective if they're able to. But and then with the right copyright requirements, you can allow other people to use it as they see for non-commercial purposes and all the other ramifications of copyrighted. Is something that we saw as a pain point for having to acquire your data back once you get it published.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And you've talked about accessibility, you've talked about open access, you've talked about transparency. How far do you think that, and also this idea that certainly open access and transparency are concepts that most of the world are starting to grapple with and trying to extend and expand. There's certainly a lot of debate and discourse around transparency in the presentation of clinical data. How far do you think transparency can be pushed in the publication of access to data and research results?
We're of the mindset that if someone really wanted to find out the protocol of a study or a deeper dive into the methodology or full results, that they can find that, perhaps, or make a request to the study sponsor or the author for more access to the data as opposed to what's already in the manuscript. Sometimes that works.
It could be a deep dive, though, right?
Yeah. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't. My limited experience with seeing requests around data transfer or data transparency, the couple papers I've seen is that for the most part, people requesting the data don't get it, right? That there's still some issues with that. Either the response is denied or it just never gets addressed in the academic circles. That's what I've seen published. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's what I sense to be the situation. I believe the EMA in Europe is publishing clinical study reports. The FDA does not. I think they had a pilot program that they tried for a couple of years and they canceled that in 2020 to look at another way. But clearly there's a push for more transparency in this whole clinical trial and data dissemination area. And that's not going to go away. I don't know what the long-term solution to that will be, but I don't think that is going away. And I think that we'll have to be ready for that as a research and medical communication and medical education field. Will have to evolve with that. And so will publishers from a publishing perspective as well. How much do you give? How much is too much? I've worked on manuscripts where there's supplemental information with 50 additional data tables. Do I expect that gets read any more than the regular manuscript? Probably not, right? So that may or may not be a good use of resources to go through that effort to do it that way and have to go through all the approval channels for that for something that might have limited utility on the user end anyway, although there may be someone looking for what is then the path for that someone who really wants to get at that information. What's the path for them, he or she, to get it? And it may not be just publish everything.
Yeah, I do want to kind of end up with your take on what's happening in what you anticipate in the future of medical publishing. Before we do that, just to circle back to one of the things that you said at the very beginning of the conversation is how challenging it is to track and really get a clear picture of who's reading data and where are they reading it. So presumably the way your process works allows you to track who's reading and how they're reading and what they're reading.
So we can give a little bit of insights on how many views it's gotten, how it is used. But really what we're trying to say is we'll get it published, right? And we'll do the best we can to expand that audience within our means. But by publishing it with the copyright situation as we publish it, we want the authors and the sponsors to be able to share it and do what they want, whether put it on other social media channels or other communications from that, and that they can do what they want. We'll do what we can do, but we want to make sure that what they can do with it as well too, because it is important to share information, because you can publish in a great journal or a decent journal or anywhere, and you're not sure how many people are going to see that. And the research shows maybe a third of the time or less people are looking at an article. For the most part, they might be skimming an abstract or glancing through the figures and using their own reading strategies to get at it. There's 30,000 or so medical journals. We're trying to do another publishing channel to fit into that mix. We think we're different than journals, but we are trying to be in that environment where you have a peer-reviewed opportunity to publish your data. We see an opportunity to improve on some of those pain points. And like I said, offer another approach to do it. It may not be for every type of data set, but we think there are a number of data sets that are well suited to this. And I didn't mention, you were talking about before about the med ed stuff, but I also think like digital health initiatives. We're tracking patient data all the time, either through devices or apps. And it's gone beyond just, hey, here's a reminder, take your medicine today. Some of the digital apps are asking, how's your pain today? Even if pain may not be a primary symptom of the condition. How'd you sleep last night? What's your quality of life today? Were you able to work? And there's all this data out there that might inform the patient discussion and the patient journey, to have someone say, hey, other people are out there like me. They struggle with the same things I struggle with. And we think is informative, right? It may not be a phase 3 clinical trial for a new breakthrough medicine, but it is important to people's health and quality of life and that whole patient journey.
So are you at the beginning of a wave in medical publishing? Where do you see things going in the future?
Digital enhancements are happening. Visual presentations, journals are doing them. There's audio slides and videos and all these other kind of what referred to as data enhancements, but they're still tied to a long manuscript, right? To a 3,000 or 4,000 word text manuscript that takes many months to write and develop and review and get peer reviewed and deal with high rejection rates at journals and stuff like that. The data enhancement or digital enhancement is an add-on to that. And we're trying to get right to that digital presentation format that most people may want to read in that format anyway, as opposed to seeing a long manuscript. And that's happening. I didn't want to sit here 3 or 5 years from now and say I didn't take a shot to try and address pain points that I saw in the medical communication process, and say, I wish I would have taken a shot to accelerate the pace of medical research communication, because I think there's an opportunity there to do something better, and not better, but faster, and to put it into a format that people can actually use. I don't think manuscripts are going to go away in the short term, but maybe down the road, as our communication tools have evolved and how we're used to receiving information, this is going to evolve as well. And I think the business model around how publishers have to deal with the transparency issues, the open access initiatives. It's not just governments that are asking their funded research to be published open access. It's funding bodies like the Wellcome Trust and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation are all asking that the research they fund is published open access. So there are changes happening, and it's really picked up, it seems, over the past couple of years. And we're trying with the Research Post to be part of that solution to offer another opportunity or another option to publish quality peer-reviewed medical research in healthcare and medical fields.
And where can people find you if they want to explore what you're doing at the Research Post?
Yeah, the website is www.theresearchpost.com. You have to get into the website address. And I always say if it's good enough for thelancet.com, it's good enough for theresearchpost.com. So that's where we're at. We've published a few posts so far, and we're certainly seeking to get more submissions from various therapeutic areas and different data formats, because we're looking to help authors publish their data across all different kinds of areas.
And the is not to be confused with the British band from the 1980s. And we'll make sure to include a link in the show notes to theresearchpost.com.
Thank you.
Mark Riotto, thank you very much for sharing your insights on medical publications and the 3, 2, 1. Thank you for sharing your insights on medical publishing and what you're doing at the Research Post to bring a more visual experience to the process of reading about and learning from clinical data.